The contradictions here with respect to the outside power who's come in here with a material imperative, all coded up in ideological, moral, ethical garb. Look at the contradictions with respect to this fellow here. This is Osama bin Laden, of course, the principal author, head of Al-Qaeda, the principal author of the 9/11 attack on the United States, where you had about 3,000 or so lives that were lost in the United States. And it was seemingly, from the U.S. perspective, popular perspective, an unprovoked attack. And no doubt an act of terrorism. And of course, the response is, as indicated by these photos, was quite visceral against this particular fellow. And oddly enough, what really angered Osama bin Laden here against the United States was that he'd become soured on U.S.-Saudi relations, being what they are. He got especially mad at his own country's governance when the Saudi government, which is the custodian, in fact, Saudi Arabia is the custodian for the holiest cities and shrines of the Islamic world. We've already talked about that. Thus, Saudi soil is supposed to be sacred. And of course, the Saudi government, though, had allowed infidels, that is, unbelievers, in the form of the United States and its allied armies, to set foot on holy soil in the run-up to the ejection of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, because the United States assembled its coalition on Saudi soil. And of course, the Saudi government was happy to have the United States there to defend it against possible further expansion by Saddam Hussein. But nevertheless, in the opinion of Mr. bin Laden here, you can't have foreign armies, the feet of infidels on holy soil, even if it was to protect Saudi Arabia and the U.S. oil interests. And so that was the last straw. It was sacrilege. And that was what really finally set him off. He had plenty of other complaints, but that's what really set him off against the United States. Well, as I mentioned, naturally the United States was a little upset about being attacked in this fashion. The United States, therefore, condemned radical Islam and its use of violence in this attack upon the United States. But with respect to this fella specifically, 22 years earlier, as you can see here, another great outside power was forcing its way into the Middle East. And that was the Russians, and when they were still the USSR, the Soviet Union. The Russians were forcing their way in when they went into Afghanistan. They'll say they were invited in, but let's not be naive. It's more sophisticated than that. And of course, this concerned the United States because the United States was the premier, the superpower, who had pretty much secured the critical relations necessary to secure the oil in the Persian Gulf. And here you had an outside power, the principal geopolitical adversary of the United States, forcing its way in. This was threatening U.S. interests. And so what did the United States do? The United States supported, gave arms to Muslim fanatics. The thought was these Muslim fanatics will represent good, self-motivated military resistance against the entry of the Russians. They were called the Mujahideen. They would be a great bulwark against Russian absorption of Afghanistan and Russian pressing itself into the U.S.'s political interests and material interests. And by the way, of the numerous weapons given to these Muslim fanatics that the United States was supporting was anti-plane handheld Stinger missiles, as you can see here, And these were given specifically to this operation in Afghanistan because that was the principal advantage the Soviets really had. It neutralized these stingers, neutralized the great advantage the Russians had, which were essentially, air power and helicopter power. Critical in that particular landscape. And who was one of these Muslim fanatics who were armed with this weaponry that the United States supported, who thought it was a good idea to have Muslim fanatics heavily armed, oddly enough, with anti-plane weaponry? Well, Osama bin Laden. So the complaint, this was the war from 79 to 89 in Afghanistan. The Afghans, the Mujahideen, the Afghan resistance against the USSR. So the complaint by 22 years later by the United States after 9/11 that 9/11 was an outrageous act by a Muslim fanatic practicing terrorism was obviously, the quality of that argument was obviously compromised by having supported just that type of fanatic when it was geopolitically useful. Yet more twisted contradictions in the Middle East. In fact, this would spin out even further. So emboldened was, by the way, the Mujahideen resistance here against the Russians was successful. The Russians left in 1989. They were pushed out. It was called their Vietnam. They just lost. They got beat. So emboldened was the Muslim resistance to essentially stopping a great power from coming into the Middle East, that these Muslim nationalists said to themselves, where else is there a Muslim population that's being aggressed upon by a big outside power that we can now go and try to push them out? Where? Remember the situation right next door. Here in Kashmir from India. We've already talked about that. That Kashmir is the only state left in India with a Muslim majority. India being a Hindu-dominated state, the rest of the Muslim-dominated areas have broken free. And so therefore, these Muslims, having been successful here, a lot of them went over there and aggravated that situation with India. Again, do you see how the problems spin out of control in directions you couldn't predict? Thus, you have a cursory look at the larger geopolitics of the outside powers in the Middle East in just the 20th century. And remember, critical for you to remember, what I've circled here about, with respect to the critical historical geographic factors preventing the consolidation of the Middle East, contributing to its political instability. I've circled that key point down there, that the result of these factors is a region highly valued by external powers, but a politically fragmented region that is weak and unable to repulse foreign influences and interventions. This has been historically evident and is evident today. Oil is just a 20th century aggravation of that importance of the Middle East. So therefore, with respect to this observation that ultimately these states in the Middle East remain undeveloped politically and economically and fragmented amongst themselves, the result is, as you can see here, this is what the Arab populations, the common people, Arabs in the region see, all right? They see this, as encircled in black here, that's the core of the Middle East there, that authoritarian regimes prevail here. Unlike increasingly in the late 20th century, the rest of the world, which has been democratized for the most part, however problematic are those democracies. And so you see autocratic governance. This is what the common Arab sees over here. Call it a monarch if you like, or a military-led government. It's still autocratic. These governments suppress human rights and concentrate wealth. The locals see this. The top map shows you routine human rights violating countries, and you can see how the Middle East is well represented there. The bottom map here shows countries with high institutionalized discrimination within them, and the Middle East is, of course, extant in there as well, especially with respect to the treatment of females. And of course, the outside world sees these autocratic regimes and their effects domestically, and they see that these regimes are allied with the great powers that are external to reason. In the 20th century, that's the United States and the British. And always keep in mind, you can see, we'll put it this way, consistent with that, this map over here. Therefore, you understand a map like this that shows you U.S. military presence and oil infrastructure in the Middle East. And you can see the great presence of U.S. military infrastructure in the region. Troops, bases, ships. You can see the coinciding nature of the U.S. military presence and oil-producing infrastructure. And of course, most notably right in here is Saudi Arabia with the largest reserves in the world. If one was to embark on a policy, the United States on a policy of bringing freedom and suppressing terror, why wouldn't one start with a state like Saudi Arabia that you have already substantial influence and troops in? Especially since 9/11, the 15 of the 19 terrorists came from there. So the policy of the United States is, like I said, the ideological or ethical, certainly the human rights emphasis the United States says it has in its foreign policy is entirely compromised by its behavior in the Middle East and elsewhere, but certainly the Middle East is the most obvious example. All right? And always keep in mind, with respect to these problems in the Middle East between these states, remember we talked about this in sub-Saharan Africa. Look who's drawn all the maps for the most part. Have a look at this. Remember, I've already shown you this. We'll go through them just to show you how constructed the Middle East is out of Western imperatives. Iraq created in 1920. Syria in 1920 in effect as well. Lebanon 1926. Transjordan, now Jordan, 1946. Kuwait, 1961. And I've already talked, of course, about Iran, which ironically, again, was the first regional Muslim country after Turkey to establish a democratic system. And that democracy was overthrown in 1953. These regimes, these countries have been a product largely of, anatomically speaking, the peoples, of course, are historical, but these borders are largely a product of Western interests, arguably contribute to the problems like you saw in sub-Saharan Africa, especially after independence. But the regimes, these authoritarian regimes, have been dependent on Western support, often against their own populations who are demanding more freedom and representation. I've already showed you this graph, but again, I'll just emphasize the point. The principal arms sellers to these regimes are the great Western powers. Here's a photo of Prince Charles, whatever, and other external, other leaders of great powers outside of the Middle East coming to the Middle East, celebrating in the camaraderie of mutual alliance, usually after a big arms sale, by the way, in support of these authoritarian regimes. Therefore, when the United States starts talking about democracy in the region, you get a reaction like this, where the locals are simply not going to believe the periodic assertion of the United States or other Western powers that their interests are humanitarian or democratic. There's no history for it. Most of that type of rhetoric is said for domestic consumption here back home. The locals in the Middle East scoff at that. They have their own history that suggests that multiple times over. Therefore, these Western powers, essentially coming into the Middle East, led by autocrats, are essentially riding the tiger, as this image suggests. The Western powers enable these tigers, then they try to ride these things. But it's a dangerous act, because if you're liable to get thrown off and bit. Now, an observation worth making is that support for militarism and authoritarianism in the region by the Western powers has another key effect that you may not have realized, and that is implied here. Note with respect to the hostilities here how I have not even mentioned the role of Islam. Why haven't I talked about the contributing role of Islam? Because it's not necessary to do so. Islam is not the cause of the discord in the region. It is largely a consequence. In other words, the reaction of regional populations to the external powers' intervention in the region is the same reaction as any group would react to outside powers coming in, including yourselves. And it's not a product of Islam. What I'm saying is, since there is little democratic representation in the region, little mass institutional mechanism for popular expression, what is the only institution that articulates mass concerns and actively expresses resentment with the outside interference in local affairs? What's the only institution left of which locals can use to protest the status quo, the illiberal status quo? The answer to that is the church, Islam. And the worse circumstances get in the region, the more people are going to move towards Islam and further radicalize Islam. Again, you could take all Muslims out of the region historically and just put in all left-handed people with red hair and a great jump shot. You can put the whole region comprised of those people. Those people will react the same way to outsiders coming in. They'll react the same way. It's the character of Islam isn't the problem. The character of Islam is getting shaped by the illiberal political systems that do not allow for conscientious and institutional participation by the general population. In other words, Islam is a strange, I'll say beneficiary, we don't have to use that word, of all that pent-up resentment. I'm not saying Islam is irrelevant. I'm just saying that Islam is just a vehicle and not the driver of the problem. It often shapes and flavors the reaction, often in Islamic rhetoric, but it doesn't generate it. Now, a certain event, and I'm about to finish up here, but the certain event that you need to know, because I'm going to ask you about it, but it's critical to know, generally anyway, is this little event that occurred in 2011. The desire by largely urban younger citizens to be free of these foreign-aligned autocratic regimes so that they might have more opportunity and more freedom, like they could see on the internet in Western democracies. The desire for that by Arab populations in the big cities resulted in a series of largely nonviolent initially, demonstrations, street demonstrations, that would come to be known as the Arab Spring. And you can see by that photo here, what they're asking for. So pretty much Western liberal values. We want to live in those type of states and have economic opportunity. We don't have enough economic opportunity even if we're educated. We want to get rid of these autocratic regimes supported by the West. And take note here when you look at this magazine cover, because it pairs, as you can see over here, protest and technology. It shows you that the people who were, by and large, protesting were primarily a young urban demographic that was rising up. And usually, these authoritarian regimes can suffocate protests against them. But in the current era, with the iPhones, the internet, using sites like social media like Facebook and Twitter, all right, you found that the populations here could not be easily controlled. They can organize resistance a little better. In other words, the government could control all communication. And then, of course, who's the most prolific at these new social media and technology platforms? It's going to be the younger population. So it was the urban younger population, by and large, that started to rise up in the Arab Spring. And as this map shows here, and they shouldn't have used bombs, but it's whatever, just go with it, this particular map. It started actually quite unexpectedly in Tunisia here, where I believe a protester self-immolated himself, if I recall. In protest, he did what? He set himself on fire. He was protesting the authoritarian regime. And this turned out to be a spontaneous spark that resounded across the Arab-speaking world. As you can see, it went from all over the place that you started seeing the young people in the large cities coming out and complaining and organizing. And the problem with the Arab Spring is indicated by here, because it threw the outside world into a quandary, especially the major powers, the British, United States. How should the outside powers react to the Arab Spring? Now remember, since the outside powers are here to pursue their own material agendas, of course I'll never put it that way, since they're here to pursue their own agendas, the critical fact is whether the regime is a compliant regime with the outside powers or not whether it respects human rights or it's democratic or anything else. As you can see here, should the outside powers, let's say the United States here, since it's predominant, all right, should the United States support growing liberal democracy and human rights amongst these populations in the Arab Spring, hoping that they succeed and become and remain U.S. allies? Should it do that? Or should the United States support the tenuous stability of alliances with these status quo dictators, taking a risk that they don't get overthrown, which would risk alienation from the United States? What should you do? Well, here's what the United States did, and perhaps it was predictable. Outlined in red, where I've got pointed here with these arrows, these countries were U.S. allies that were experiencing Arab Spring. And therefore, the United States did not publicly support the Arab Spring in these autocratic countries. It didn't oppose it; it just didn't speak up for the people calling for liberalization and the respect of human rights, because these were already allies to the United States. Now, these two states experiencing the Arab Spring were not allies to the United States. Muammar Gaddafi was allied to no one at this particular time. He was aggravating everyone. And Syria was an ally or a client state of the Russians. Still is. Therefore, the United States publicly supported the Arab Spring in these autocratic countries, saying it wanted to see more liberal democracy there. Does that sound expedient, utilitarian, amoral? Of course it is. This is Middle East politics. The most enduring problem was here. Saddam Hussein, of course, Muammar Gaddafi here would soon be killed in internal problems. Libya would fall into chaos. But the most enduring problem was what happened in Syria here. That problem is ongoing. Because the destabilizing effects of the Arab Spring allowed an ultra-Islamic fundamentalist group practicing some kind of obscurantist interpretation of Islam. And anyway, this group rose up. Actually, they rose up all over the Middle East, but they rose up with some vigor in Syria. And what I'm talking about here, and by the way, there were many groups that rose up in Syria. Syria has a whole bunch of different groups with different agendas fighting against the central government of Bashar al-Assad. But the one that most concerned the United States and the Western powers was the group I just mentioned here, this ultra-fundamentalist group, which you've heard of, called ISIS. And at its apex, here are the lands ISIS were occupying. And what ISIS wanted was, well, you can just tell by its name. ISIS means the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS. What ISIS was trying to do is it wanted to obliterate the political geography that was largely constructed by the West and create, again, a new state here out of what logic it had fashioned for why it should exist. And this new state was going to be under the guise of some form of Islam. Again, the form of Islam that ISIS was posing that no Muslim had ever heard of. And of course, as you're well aware, and is quite appropriate, ISIS practiced an array of atrocities that were really quite colorful. They broadcast public beheadings, serial rapes of non-Muslim women, throwing men off a roof for being gay, chopping off hands. Again, as I mentioned before, once you channel all the disappointment and sense of injustice through one institution that claims to have a monopoly on truth, righteousness, and change, that's the church, where you don't allow normal political or legal institutions to conduct people's aspirations and grievances, what you're going to get is some seriously cathartic, relief-generating radicalism, and that's ISIS. ISIS was a proposition that could never work. ISIS could never work because they're advocating for an ultra-conservative form of Islam, which was directly against what most of the Arab Spring was about. That was about young people wanting more liberalism in urban areas. Not ISIS, but once you open the door of instability during the Arab Spring, you don't know who might jump through. In fact, you can see by this map over here, the red dots represent a massive outflow of refugees fleeing the violence in 2004. I mean, the problems here produced a massive outflow of refugees. Most of them, by the way, disproportionately heading to Western Europe, various countries, causing a lot of reaction in Europe, even in the United States, about we don't want to take in, these Muslims and all that type of stuff that unfortunately animates the present status quo. Nevertheless, it was interesting because you got statements like this against ISIS, which, by the way, are appropriate. Have a look at this here. This was a statement made by President Obama after some ISIS outrages. There are quite a few of them. And what did he say there? Let's be clear about ISIS, called Daesh in the region. Well, let's be clear about ISIS. They have rampaged across cities and villages, killing innocent, unarmed civilians in cowardly acts of violence. No just God would stand for what they did yesterday and what they do every single day. Understood and agreed, ISIS is doing outrageous stuff. Now, I don't know anything about any just gods, but for unfortunately the West to complain about outrageous human rights violations is astonishing. Whether it be supporting Saddam's mass murderers of Kurdish villagers with chemical weapons, political murders too many to speak of, drone strikes of innocent wedding parties, drone strikes of relief ambulances, or whether it be an allied Saudi regime that routinely cuts off body parts publicly. I believe it's on Friday afternoons. For the United States to suddenly suggest moral outrage as something more most everybody has long since relinquished, we'll put it this way. The United States, unfortunately, like other outside powers, not unique to the United States, has long since relinquished that argument that ethics or morals and barbarity are unacceptable. I have no doubt that ISIS was doing these things in greater frequency, but I hardly think that the frequency of occurrence is the standard for moral outrage, all right, and not the moral outrage itself. So if the violent excesses of ISIS are not the base reason for the U.S. reaction of outrage about what ISIS was doing, you must ask yourself, then what is? Well, this is a geography class. It's a matter of geography. Have a look at this map here. Here you can see in orange here was ISIS at its apex. And as you can see, ISIS was pressing in on the massive Iraqi oil fields. Oil fields that the United States had undertook the 2003 Iraq War to reintegrate into the world economy. Unfortunately, folks, moral outrage is almost always the icing on top of material reality and material benefit. Okay, I think I'm going to finish with the Middle East there. There's so much more to talk about, so many more trails and things I could point out, but this is a general survey class. We don't have that type of. I think you get the idea of the general model of outside powers coming in historically, going all the way back to the Roman Empire because of the geographical positioning of this land and how it becomes central to the economies of the great powers. The great powers are great powers because of their economies. So you have a general backgrounding there. You understand why, since it's the crossroads of the world, you get all these new religious, theological, and political institutions being projected because you have the cross-pollination of ideas. Unfortunately, they clash violently at times. You understand that general framing and how the 20th century fits in there nicely. Oil, again, just being a recent aggravating factor. Therefore, you understand this cartoon. To conclude things, this problem is still ongoing into the 21st century for the Middle East. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for the Middle East. And I always have to, I'm going to leave what I didn't talk about. I didn't spend time talking about Egypt, which is sort of, fundamental, an important country. In fact, Egypt is the largest Arab country. It's not the largest Muslim country, but it's of the Arab-speaking peoples. Egypt's the largest country. It deserves focus, but time constraints sort of limit me here. I'm going to leave that to the text. So make sure you read the text on this, and we'll leave the Middle East there.